We move on to the final presentation, and we go really down south in Africa. And we have a presentation from Tavatswa Mabhaudhi, and he's a researcher at the School of Agriculture, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So, Tavatswa, the floor is yours. And I wanted to say that we do have 10 minutes more for discussion, so you have your full 10-15 minutes for your presentation now. So.
Thank you, Chair. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share the work that we have been doing in South Africa. So I'll be presenting on a summary of a project that we have undertaken in South Africa related to the WEF Nexus. So one of the things about presenting last is, people have taken all the thunder and said everything. So, so I need to avoid a lot of repetition. So I'll avoid the definitions and stuff. And just to give some background to our issues in South Africa, South Africa is a water-scarce country. We are one of the 30 driest countries in the world. Much of South Africa is classified as being arid to semi-arid. In terms of context, we have high food insecurity. Whilst we are food secure at a national level, about 30% of households still face massive food insecurity. Owing to the background of South Africa, we have massive issues of inequality and poverty. So we are very much a developmental state. We have challenges related to sustainable resource management and how to govern those. And we've been looking at various strategies of informing and implementing sustainable economic development. And that is the context in which the WEF Nexus is being viewed from a South African perspective in terms of job creation, reducing poverty and inequality, and closely linking it to Sustainable Development Goals 2, 6, and 7. So from a national perspective, South Africa does have a lot of information from a sector-based perspective related to the governance of the three sectors. The Water, Energy, Food Nexus, we started working on it from about 2014, and there have been several projects that have happened, but those have mainly taken foot from 2016 onwards. And the research has mostly been driven through the universities, funded mostly by the Water Research Commission of South Africa, which is a state-funded agency with a mandate for funding research in the water sector. So, like I said, South Africa is generally more advanced relative to our neighbors in Southern Africa. So normally when we want to do comparisons for Southern Africa, we would remove South Africa. It kind of distorts the information. So in terms of the key indicators, since 1994, there has been a steady improvement and increase in access to water, access to electricity, and access to food. And that's primarily coming from a background of apartheid, where there was a lot of segregation and exclusion. So there has been a steady increase in those, but it has also created a subsequent burden on the system. From a provincial perspective, there are key issues in South Africa which are related to the water, energy, food nexus. One is a question around the sustainability of exporting virtual water. Those who are familiar or who have been reading would have read about the drought in Cape Town, which reached a critical point last year or so. They were looking at day zero. And there's a lot of exporting that happens from the Western Cape in general, fruit, vine, and so forth. And questions are being asked now in terms of the sustainability of the province going forward in terms of exporting fruit, which we're looking at as virtual water export, and the returns of doing that. So that is a key water, energy, food nexus type of issue. We've also got issues related to the threats on agricultural land in terms of colonization by alien invasive species, which is reducing amount of arable land as well as grazing lands in other provinces of South Africa. We also have issues related to expansion in energy in other provinces of South Africa, such as Mpumalanga, where coal mining concessions have been granted on land that was, or that is some of the most fertile land in South Africa. And there are risks because it's also located in one of the most sensitive catchments in the country. So there again, you've got energy considerations overriding food and water considerations. In terms of energy, again, we've got a sensitive issue that is still being debated in the Karoo, which is a very dry area, but they found deposits of shale gas, so they want to do fracking in that area. But it's a very sensitive area. It's very water scarce. If there's a drought, it's one of the hardest hit areas. But again, you have energy considerations almost overriding the other two, water and food in that area. And then what we have done in South Africa is we started looking at the WEF Nexus from trying to understand convergence from a sector-based perspective. So we did some policy analysis right at the beginning to look at whether our policy framework actually allows or would facilitate the adoption of the water, energy, food nexus. So South Africa has world-class policies and documents. We've got a very progressive constitution and very progressive laws. However, the current policy framework is still very sector-based and driven from a strongly sectorial perspective. So whilst there are key national documents such as the Constitution and National Development Plan, which speak to integration, the policies on the ground themselves limit the integration from a practical perspective. At a technical level, some of the things that we have been looking at in South Africa is the need to diversify our energy mix. So unlike other countries in the region that strongly rely on hydroelectricity, South Africa's energy mix is mostly driven by coal. So there's a need to diversify that and promote more green technology, more renewable energy sources. Recently, our president announced in his State of the Nation address the need to innovate and come up with a smart city. So again, we're looking at technologies in that space. One of the key challenges that we have in terms of managing resources is around the issue of education and access to information. So it reminded me of what one lady said at the beginning of this meeting, who was talking about women fetching firewood and water. And that also presents another challenge that we have, that there is policy mismatch. So if you recall at the beginning, I mentioned that South Africa is food secure at a national level, but there is still about 6.8 million people who face hunger every day, another 10.4 million who have inadequate access to food, roughly about 30% of the population being food insecure. So if you look at the national statistics and the household level statistics, there's a mismatch. but the level of formulation of policy is at the national level, but the level at which you want to bring about change is at the household level. So you get a mismatch in that the policies drive food security at national, but at the household level, the household dynamics still remain unchanged, and that is still exacerbating things like poverty and inequality. And where, as I said, they are looking at the wealth nexus in terms of trying to turn around that whole situation of inequality and poverty. So implementing the wealth nexus in South Africa, so far we've held multi-stakeholder dialogues. So the GWP dialogues was one of them. We've had one that we facilitated with Future Earth in 2017 as well. And there have been other smaller dialogues facilitated by the Water Research Commission, the most recent one having happened in February this year. There is scope for improvement of information and interest to be generated. However, we face key challenges in terms of implementing the wealth nexus, and those are related to access to data that is comparable and robust enough. There is the question on research methodologies that need to be improved for the wealth nexus to allow for wealth nexus performance, evaluation and monitoring. So that is just a summary of those, a review of some of our policies in terms of facilitating the convergence that is needed to inform implementation. We've attempted to develop a framework to guide implementation of the wealth nexus in South Africa, where we've identified the drivers or challenges, and we've identified the desirable outcomes and goals, and those are mostly aligned to the sustainable development agenda in terms of where we want to get to as South Africa and how we would want to unlock the wealth nexus. And that has to be driven by policies that facilitate innovation in that space and also unlock finances, especially from the international donors, to be able to help us move in that direction. We need to be able, one of the limitations for adoption of the wealth nexus that we have identified from our research is that there is a lack of indices and metrics for analyzing and evaluating the wealth nexus. So that means even when people try to work together, but for reporting purposes, they default back to the sector-based, and that also disincentivizes the collaboration. So we are doing research on developing a composite wealth nexus index and an analytical framework. Key challenges, which I've highlighted before, and our conclusions. So the main conclusion coming from the work that we are doing is, one, we need to develop an analytical model for assessing wealth nexus performance matched to a wealth nexus score. We need to develop a framework beyond this that actually guides implementation. How do we operationalize the wealth nexus? We need to answer a key question with regards to scale. Where does it make the most sense to apply the wealth nexus? People mentioned earlier on the transboundary nature of resources. Water is transboundary in Southern Africa and managed at that level. Energy, also through the Southern African power pool, is driven from a regional perspective. It's only food mostly where countries choose a national food self-sufficiency agenda. But given climate change and the trade-offs that we are seeing, we might need to shift that national approach to food security and look at a regional one. From a national perspective, where does it make sense? National, provincial, catchment-based, where do we implement the wealth nexus? Thank you.
Thank you, Tavatsva, and thank you as well for highlighting the need to develop indices, metrics around the Nexus, which is indeed not an easy one.